Welcome to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. Today I'm going to be looking at the importance of Michael Jordan on basketball cards, primarily in the 1990s, but most of this video is going to be talking more about his importance to the NBA itself, because the two go hand in hand. And the problem that the NBA has always had is that of the four main sports, it is the sport that was it's really interesting because it's the sport that everybody played, but that nobody followed. Baseball has been that long-standing great American sport that was always just kind of the sport that everybody played. But back in the time of Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth, they really did need somebody who was bigger than the sport, who had the ability to be a legend at almost a godlike level. Because, look, people kind of knew who Ty Cobb was, but this was a time before radio. And so that meant that communication was almost non-existent. So if you grew up in the middle of Iowa, how in the world would you know anything about any baseball team? You probably know about the St. Louis Cardinals. But past that, you really wouldn't know hardly anything about baseball. And at that time, it wasn't really that big of a deal because the country had not yet become interconnected and we did not yet have a national economy. In fact, very few products were really nationwide products at that time. So baseball didn't absolutely need for there to be a player of a legendary stature, except that they needed to have that as a groundwork for what would happen after World War II when we did become an interconnected society. And so a player like Babe Ruth was this name that could travel even farther than Major League Baseball could, and he could be just this legendary ethereal person, such that after World War II in the 1950s, when kids were falling into a national world of following baseball, where you could follow any baseball team anywhere in the country, eventually even on television, but at least on radio, and certainly through newspapers, there was this one name that was bigger than any other, and that name carried baseball to make sure that any young fan knew that baseball was the great sport because of the great player. It was a really helpful feature for baseball, something that college football had as well with the Four Horsemen and the Galloping Ghost. There were these legendary players where you could watch football in Houston or you could go to games at Stanford, but you would still know about teams in Michigan and teams in Yale. You could still know about these great college teams, even though you never saw them. You never saw them play. You didn't know what any of the athletes looked like. But there were these names that were so large that you knew there was this bigger world. And in an analog world prior to nationwide communication, this was a convenience that these sports were able to enjoy, that the NFL didn't have, because the NFL was just another professional football league, which is the way that it was early on. And so the NFL needed to get enough of these names traveling over to the NFL where people go, oh, the Galloping Ghost is now in the NFL, and oh, Johnny Lujack is now in the NFL. Get the association of these national superstars. Now your league is starting to become known by those figures. But the NFL was able to ride great management by the governing bodies to be able to build itself up into a great sport nationwide without the need of superstars that could carry the league. So by the late 1980s, when football finally surpassed baseball as the most popular sport in America, it still didn't have that one superstar. Unitas was the closest that the NFL had to a great superstar that was truly known nationwide, but he was still just another football player. They were able to do it all on their own, but they still rode on the coattails of the early prestige of college football. So they had an advantage. But another thing about both baseball and football is that they are grand spectacles. You go into these big sports stadiums with massive numbers of fans, this big field in the middle. It's kind of like going into a cathedral. It is a great spectacle. Basketball, on the other hand, you're right down, they're literally people with their feet right next to the court. It's a very small space, the game itself is not designed to have great spectacle. You got to really pay attention to what's going on. And while hockey is very similar, hockey was regional. So it was smart enough to just be 6 teams for years where you could literally go and watch your team play. And then it slowly built out from there. But it built a local fan base that was incredibly loyal. and then slowly but surely was able to become a bigger sport. Football was not quite as locally confined, and it was able to ride on like I said, the coattails of college football. But in the case of basketball, it didn't have any of those conveniences. It didn't have the local support because you could go watch your high school team play and your college team play. You could watch grade school players play. That was kind of the way that basketball was. What it needed to do, which hockey didn't need to do, was basketball needed to prove that it was amazing. It needed superstars and it needed excitement. And Dr. J was the first true superstar in the NBA. But the game itself still was not considered very exciting. It was Larry Bird and Magic Johnson that turned it into an exciting sport. And because of the focus they had going into the finals and battling it out, all of a sudden the stakes were raised and people were looking at the NBA as a serious sport. But they also had the slam dunk competition, which inspired an entire generation of young kids to get excited about the game. So now you got the excitement, but your legend is coming to the end of his career. And so now they had all the pieces in place, but they needed a new legend to lead them forward. And that came in the form of Michael Jordan. Now the advantage for Jordan was that he was a player at a level we had just never seen in basketball. We had players back in the 60s who scored ridiculous numbers of points, but there was no defense played, there was no structure to the game. It was more like a fun thing that was happening off on the side. Here we had a guy averaging 35 points a game for an entire season. And you look at him and you go, if he had one more good player on his team, he could be successful. Look how far he dragged his team toward the finals, all by himself. And so now you get a fan base looking at this guy who is just incredibly skilled, who is being held back by the inconvenience of having a team that's not built to be able to take advantage of what he brings. And that's what fans were now really focused on. They were able to ride the story of Michael Jordan. Is he finally going to be able to succeed? Is he going to get the team around him? Does he need to go to another team? All of these storylines were just really wonderful, wonderful pieces to a story that the NBA desperately needed, because now he was this player who was in fact larger than the league. Dr. J had been that, but now we were watching in real time as Michael Jordan was pursuing that championship. And the NBA all of a sudden became a household name. It grew and grew and grew through the decade until when Michael Jordan retired, all of a sudden there was this big void where nobody knew what to do at this point. And that was because most of the focus on the NBA was focused on Michael Jordan and his journey. We were becoming fans of teams, becoming fans of players, but when Michael left, there was this critical piece that we all didn't realize was the cornerstone of what drove the NBA. It was really critical for the league. And so the league took a major dip until Jordan came back, and then at that point we had started to acclimate to the understanding that Michael was just a part of the NBA. So the ratings shot back up, the interest returned, but after 3 years when he retired the second time, now we already were paying attention to other players better, so that Grant Hill, Allen Iverson, Tim Duncan, eventually Vince Carter, we had Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson. All of a sudden now these guys were able to carry our interest. We were paying attention in the right way, and the league had become a complete whole. That was critical for the league to be able to make the step that it needed to become the third big sport in the American sports landscape. So it was a wonderful blessing that the NBA had, that he happened to come at the right time to give all the pieces that the NBA needed. Now, in the world of sports cards, basketball was a backwater all the way into 1990. 1990 was the first year that sports cards started to become a serious affair. That was when the first Beckett Monthly came out, which was it was a sign that the basketball cards were becoming more important. But you also had this perfect storm of all the pieces in place for culture, pop culture, to now be able to embrace the NBA. This was happening right at the time when Jordan was still trying to get through Detroit. And now, talk about perfect for the NBA. When you looked at the Lakers and the Celtics, the intense games that they played were just intense games. The Pistons, however, were I'm not going to say cheaters because I don't want to be too on the nose, but you get the idea. They were the bad boys. They were the evil people who were holding back the good, saintly Michael Jordan from winning a championship. And he needed to vanquish the evil arch nemesis. Talk about an incredible storyline. And so now that that storyline is becoming cemented and sports cards are becoming more popular, but also as sports cards are becoming better made, now the NBA is perfectly situated so that sports cards for basketball are cards we're starting to really pay attention to. And NBA Hoops and Skybox did an incredible job of providing us with what we needed to get excited about the league. Now, in 1990, Michael Jordan was almost equal to Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and David Robinson. Those four names are the four names we were pursuing in cards. Jordan had the edge, but it wasn't about Michael Jordan. In 1991, that finally started to change, in large part because of the fact that Upper Deck signed a contract with Michael Jordan, like they did with Joe Montana over in football, of getting the biggest name and locking him into a contract so they could really take advantage of making a bunch of special Michael Jordan cards, which would really be what they would do in 1992, not in 1991. But by 1991, we were transitioning to where Magic Johnson and Larry Bird were at the end of their careers. They were moving on. They were about to retire. And Michael Jordan was now the future. He was finally able to win the finals, which was about stinking time. Everything was in place. But also there was this whole fervor that was building around Michael in terms of I Want to Be Like Mike, in terms of the Michael Jordan's Playground video. All of those pieces were perfect so that Michael became a brand that was so far bigger than the NBA. And in sports cards, that meant that you had a whole generation of kids coming up going, Jordan is the greatest, and I like. And that became the big discussion point. It was, I'm a fan of this player. There were tons of players or fans who just liked Michael Jordan. But most of us, we had our player, and Michael Jordan was there as kind of the default, well, of course I like Michael, or you hated Michael, however it worked. But that became the nature of how we were as sports card fans in basketball. And it was a great time to be collecting basketball cards, mainly because of Hoops and Skybox, the way that they made these card sets that were really interesting, really fascinating. And yet basketball, even though it was becoming super exciting for a younger generation, it didn't have the broad appeal that both baseball and football had. So we were seeing a lot of innovation, but we weren't seeing a lot of cards. And that would plague basketball cards all through the 90s. The reason basketball cards are so expensive is because, well, I shouldn't say cards themselves as much as top cards. The reason they're so expensive isn't because they're mostly Michael Jordan cards and Jordan's in the boxes, but because the quantity was smaller. They always printed less basketball cards because we always bought less basketball cards. And speaking personally, I started out in basketball cards, and by the mid to late decade, I wasn't able to keep up, partially because football was so tough to keep up with, but partially because there was a threshold. There was the basketball card community, and we bought packs at whatever rate we could. And then there was the Jordan fans, and they were at a higher level. And the Jordan fans were the big high rollers. And they basically partitioned off the big area. I don't know that I ever bought a pack of Finest in basketball. I bought them in football, but in basketball, they were always off the shelf because the high rollers they'd take all of the really good packs. And if there were enough cards left, then the rest of us could be a part of it as well. And as you got to later on in the decade, those high rollers were carving out a larger and larger percentage of the card market, such that Topps Chrome was one that you had a difficult time getting. SPX was difficult to get your hands on, just because of the nature of how condensed, but how fierce that market was. There were a lot of us that were condensed in a small space, so we weren't the broadest range, but we were a dedicated range. And then there was this upper tier that was just rabid. And that upper tier, the reason that they were so rabid over in basketball was because Michael Jordan was such a draw. He created his own unique portion of the basketball card market. And to this day, he remains the cornerstone of the basketball card market, something LeBron James will never be able to achieve for a number of reasons. It is so bad in terms of the focus on Michael Jordan that collectors like myself, I have so many sets that are just missing the Jordan card. Because I don't want to go out and spend $60 on a Jordan card for a card set that shouldn't cost more than $30 for the whole stinking set. That is a problem that he's had, is the fact that he really has created a division in the hobby in a time where it was all about card sets, or it was mostly about card sets. He did create the individual in a time when it was all about universality. And the reason that Michael was so distinct and important for the 90s is because in the 1980s, like I said, there was Larry Bird and there was Magic Johnson. But Larry and Magic were part of 3 team constructions. It was Larry, McHale, and it was Parrish. And then it was Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and James Worthy. The 80s were the era of team basketball. The 90s, however, was... Well, actually, it was also the era of team basketball. Team basketball didn't end till the new millennium, but we don't think about the 90s as team basketball, even though it was just as much team basketball, if not more, than the 80s, because the superstar finally became the dominant feature. In the case of Dr. J, he played with a revolving cast of characters, and so it's not like he and the other guy played all these years. And so he always had that superstar stature. But in the case of Michael, he started out as a great legend, and we in the 90s prided ourselves in being able to distinguish ourselves as great basketball fans by talking about 2 players. Dennis Rodman is an underrated defensive player, and Scottie Pippen is an underrated basketball player. Not to get into the Dennis Rodman thing, with Scottie Pippen, we always would pride ourselves in saying Michael Jordan won championships because of Scottie Pippen. Jordan is championship worthy, but Scottie is critical for Jordan to win. But we would always couch that with, but Jordan is the greatest player of all time. We always had to deal with that conflict. And it's not like we were earning stripes with other people, because they knew that too. We were earning stripes with ourselves. That was the nature of it. Jordan's presence was so dominant that if you happened to realize that it wasn't all Michael Jordan, which all of us understood, then you got to consider yourself to be special and unique. But that was across the entire span of basketball, because every team was a team sport. It was built around a team. They played as a team. They won championships as a team. But there were individual players like Kevin Johnson or David Robinson who were distinct from the rest of the team. They were the guys we focused on and said, okay, Patrick Ewing is the Knicks. Well, in order for Patrick Ewing to make it to the finals, he needed John Starks, he needed Mark Jackson, he needed Charles Oakley, he needed those guys to round out the team. That's just the way 90s basketball was, and it was actually less superstar laden than the 80s had been, but it was more of a broad team sport. But those individual players like Patrick Ewing or Reggie Miller, where they had no teammates in terms of superstars, it was a lot easier to see those individual players. And that was because Michael set the stage for that by being so singularly distinct that when Allen Iverson came out, people just looked at him and said, okay, he's going to be the star on his team. With Grant Hill, he's going to be the star on his team. That was a different mindset that fans had, because we were now perceiving the game as these individual superstars, which the NBA needed. They actually needed that so that we had these iconic figures we could follow team by team by team by team. We didn't have the decades of being team fans that had been the case in football and in baseball. And especially in hockey. So in basketball, we needed those icons to help guide us through acclimating to becoming basketball fans. Unfortunately, that also set a stage so that in the new millennium, it became all about the superstars and not about the team, which is why the NBA is what it is today, like it or hate it. It is perceived as not the teams not being important. It's all about the superstars. So Michael was both a blessing and something of a curse at the same time. But for sports card collecting, we desperately needed to have that one icon that we could all wrap our heads around, and everything could pivot around him. That's what Michael Jordan brought, and he was critical for us to acclimate to collecting basketball cards, being excited about it, and having a market that was strong enough to be able to sustain the growing pains of becoming what it became in the late 1990s, which was a sustainable card market all on its own. And not just that, but a highly innovative one. Jordan was the reason for that. So it would have grown anyway, but it would have been more at the pace of hockey. It would have been a lot slower if it wasn't for having such an iconic figure. He jump-started everything and made it a lot more exciting. So that's what I'm going to say here about Michael Jordan's impact on sports cards. Leave me comments down below if you're talking about your journey with Michael Jordan's cards, what iconic cards you remember, because iconic cards for Michael Jordan, to me, it seems like they're all iconic. So I am curious what cards really stood out for you guys. Now, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. And check out the other videos that I do talking about the history of sports cards. And thank you very much for watching.